You'd never expect an owl to take in a kitten. Then again, nothing about life here in Vallmere ever unfolds the way you'd think. The skies were still gray when I first spotted her, Thimble, barely bigger than my hand, soaked and shaking beneath the edge of Maera's enclosure. She had somehow made her way through the underbrush, drawn perhaps by warmth or fate. I had taken in dozens of animals before, but never one who asked for a mother like this. Never one who looked straight at a predator with nothing but trust. And never one who made me feel this uncertain. I wasn't even supposed to be home that afternoon. A storm had cut power to the village, and I'd returned early to check the heat lamps in Maera's enclosure. That's when I saw her, this damp, pathetic scrap of life huddled right up against the aviary fence, her ribs showing through matted orange fur. For a second I thought she was dead. But then she lifted her head, blinked those ridiculous saucer eyes at me and mewed, soft but steady, like she wasn't asking. She was telling me, I'm staying. Maera had been still, silent on her perch, watching with that unreadable owl gaze of hers. And then, just as I approached to scoop Thimble up, Maera moved. Not aggressively, not defensively, just closer, as if to shield her. I should have separated them immediately. Thimble was a stray kitten, Maera was a raptor. It was absurd, dangerous, but something in me hesitated. Maera hadn't extended her wings, hadn't flared her feathers like she normally did when something unfamiliar crossed her space. She had only leaned forward, curious, quiet. I carried Thimble inside, wrapped her in a towel, and started the warm fluids. Her body was chilled nearly to the core, but even through the weakness, she kept squirming toward the glass door, as if she knew Maera was still out there, watching. By nightfall, Thimble was nestled in a shoebox beside the radiator. I thought that was the end of it. But the next morning, the shoebox was empty, and the back door, unlatched. The house was silent that morning, but it wasn't the kind of silence that settles. It was sharp, unnerving, like something had shifted while I slept. I remember standing barefoot on the old floorboards, staring at the empty shoebox as the kettle whistled in the background, its scream cutting through the fog in my head. The towel was still there, slightly crumpled, warm to the touch, but Thimble was gone. I followed instinct more than logic as I moved through the cottage, checking every crevice, every corner. It wasn't until I stepped out into the pale light of the back garden that I saw her, curled up once more at the base of Maera's enclosure, tucked just inside the open gate I swore I had locked. But there she was, not in danger, not afraid, just lying in the hollow beneath the perch as if it were the most natural place in the world for a kitten to sleep. And Maera, she was still, monumental in the half-light. She didn't lunge, didn't even so much as rustle her feathers when I opened the gate and approached. Her massive amber eyes stayed locked on mine, but not in the usual way that owls watch you, as prey, as noise, as irrelevance. It was a weighted look, deliberate and steady, and when I crouched to gather Thimble in my arms again, Maera tilted her head in that slow, owl-like arc that always seems to mean more than we know. It wasn't hostility I felt, nor indifference. It was allowance, and something close to recognition. The change began subtle, so slight I thought I was imagining it. Maera, once content to sit for hours unmoving, began pacing the edges of her enclosure, not agitated, but alert, aware of something I couldn't see. She no longer hunted her mice with the same precision, often leaving them untouched as Thimble nestled closer to her perch with each passing day. I watched, trying to balance instinct and protocol, unsure whether I was witnessing a breakdown in natural boundaries or the unfolding of something impossibly rare. It was Sia, my volunteer, who saw it first. The limp in Maera's gait, the slight trembling in her left wing. I told myself it was the cold, or maybe age creeping in. But when Jonah came by with his mobile kit, he confirmed what I hadn't wanted to name. The healed wing we thought stable was beginning to deteriorate. Scar tissue had thickened, compressing nerves. Maera was in pain, and worse, there was a chance her entire left wing could lose function if it wasn't surgically addressed. It hit harder than I expected. I'd always known Maera wasn't going back to the wild, but I had built her a world of dignity here, a place where she reigned as a solitary queen. Surgery meant stress, confinement, maybe even a permanent relocation to a sanctuary if her condition worsened. And as we talked options, Thimble brushed her tiny head against the curve of Maera's talons, unaware of how fragile this moment truly was. I couldn't stop thinking about Maera's eyes. Not the way they looked, but the way they seemed to ask something. In all the years I'd worked with animals, I'd learned to spot pain, even when it wore a mask of stillness. But this was something deeper. She was quieter now, her movements slower, but she never pushed Thimble away. Not even when the kitten curled against her breast feathers in sleep. Not even when the kitten's purrs rose like small tremors through the twilight air. And yet, despite all that grace, I couldn't shake the dread. What if her body was failing beneath the calm? Sia, on the other hand, believed in the fairy tale. She'd taken to sketching them together. Maera, the stoic protector. Thimble, the soft miracle. To her, this wasn't just rescue, it was destiny. When I mentioned the possibility of surgery, she stiffened, her gaze darkening with something I rarely saw in her: defiance. "You'd separate them now?" she asked, as if I'd broken something sacred just by thinking it. Elsie came by that evening, bringing herbal salves and questions I wasn't ready for. She said old stories told of forest owls that adopted orphaned creatures in times of imbalance, a kind of natural mending between species. I wanted to laugh, but when she looked through the mesh and whispered, maybe she chose her, I didn't. Jonah, ever practical, warned me that bonding between species was unnatural, unstable. "You're seeing what you want to see, Cal, but it's just an owl, and just a kitten." But I wasn't so sure anymore. Word spread, as it always does in a place like Vallmere, quietly at first, through whispers in the bakery line and sideways glances at the co-op. But soon enough, people began to show up. Not many, not loud. Just a few at first. Curious townsfolk who'd heard about the owl who'd taken in a kitten. They lingered outside the fence with cautious wonder in their eyes, snapping photos on phones held low, as if the reverence of the scene demanded a quieter kind of witnessing. Still, every footstep beyond that gate felt like a crack forming in the little world I'd tried to protect. Then came Ronan Bell from Animal Control, with his clipboard and firm handshake, reciting policy as though it were scripture. His concern wasn't unkind, but it was cold. Cross-species bonding is unstable, Callum. You can't monitor them forever. The owl's wild, the kitten's not. That makes this a liability. He left a notice pinned to my shed door, an official review of my license pending, effective immediately. At the same time, Maera's decline was becoming harder to ignore. She had started refusing food entirely, and though her gaze remained steady when Thimble nestled into her feathers, her body was clearly faltering. Thimble, oblivious to the weight of it all, had begun to mimic her, climbing the lower branches of Maera's perch, blinking slowly with her head tilted, feathers of down clinging to her fur like she belonged there. I stood at the edge of the enclosure that evening, caught between something that looked like love and something that felt like inevitability, and unsure whether I had the right to decide which mattered more. I found myself watching them more than I worked, not as a caretaker, but as someone lost in a question I couldn't answer. Every instinct I'd built over years of rescue work said I should intervene. Keep Thimble inside, prepare Maera for relocation, protect what I could before everything unraveled. But every time I opened that gate, Maera would stir just enough to let me know she still saw me. Not as a threat, not even as her keeper, but as something outside of their circle. And Thimble, she had stopped meowing altogether. She didn't cry for food. She didn't cry for me. Only once, when I tried to carry her indoors, did she resist, digging her claws into the soft earth beneath Maera's perch, not violently, but with a desperation so quiet it nearly broke me. I knew the time was coming to decide. Surgery for Maera couldn't wait, but taking her meant taking Thimble too. Separating them could mean unraveling what little strength Maera had left. And yet, keeping them together meant accepting something I couldn't explain, couldn't control, and possibly couldn't protect. I stood at the door that night, lights off, just listening. And through the wind I heard it, a purr, soft and steady, beneath the beat of feathers. The first feathers were found at the edge of the woods, small, white-tipped, scattered in a half-moon near the ravine where the foxes prowl. I knew they didn't belong to Maera. She never flew beyond her enclosure. But still, something about them filled me with a weight I couldn't name. Then came the second sign. Scratch marks on the aviary fence, low to the ground but deep fresh. Not the idle curiosity of a raccoon. This was something testing boundaries, looking for a way in. That same night, I set up the trail cam. What I saw the next morning left me cold. A badger, young, alone and bold, circling the enclosure at dusk, rising on hind legs, pawing at the mesh. Thimble had been inside with Maera the entire time. I didn't tell Sia at first. I didn't want to break her heart, or worse, trigger her determination. But she found the footage on my laptop and stared at it for minutes, silent. Then she said quietly, "They're not safe here anymore, are they?" I didn't have an answer. The vet called that evening to confirm Maera's surgery date, just 4 days away. Ronan left another message, this one less polite. "You're harboring an unstable dynamic," he said. "If anything happens, Callum, it's on you." I spent that night in the enclosure with them. I couldn't sleep. I just watched. Maera's eyes blinked slowly beneath the moonlight. Thimble curled beneath her wing, trusting, fragile. And I realized I was the only one left who didn't know what to do. I started keeping the enclosure gate unlatched at night. It wasn't negligence, it was choice. The truth is, I no longer believed I was keeping Maera and Thimble safe. I think they were keeping each other whole. Maera had stopped eating entirely unless Thimble was nearby. The tiny kitten would press her face into the cooled surface of a quail egg or bat at it with her paw, until Maera finally acknowledged it, nipping once, half-heartedly, as if she was doing it for the kitten's sake, not her own. Sia had taken to visiting after school every day, no longer chattering the way she used to, but moving through the garden with purpose, with reverence. She brought sketchbooks filled with images that made my breath catch, drawings of Thimble standing like a sentinel beneath Maera's broad chest, the owl watching stars with eyes full of sadness. "She's fading," Sia said softly one evening, "but she's not afraid, maybe because she knows she won't be alone." Elsie returned too, with a story I didn't expect. She told me of an old healer's tale from the Highlands, of an owl and a fox cub, both motherless, who lived together through a blizzard. "Sometimes the forest does strange things when it wants something to live," she said, "even if the world doesn't understand it." And Jonah, he softened. After watching the two of them one evening, he murmured, "You ever think maybe this bond is what's keeping her alive?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. That night, as the wind picked up and frost threatened the ground, I moved Thimble's blanket closer to Maera's perch. And for the first time, Maera reached down, not with her beak, not with a warning, but with one wide, feathered wing, and pulled the kitten beneath it. 3 days before the surgery, Ronan returned, not with warnings this time, but with paperwork. The shelter board had reviewed the situation. I was told, plainly and without room for appeal, that if I didn't relocate Maera to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center by the end of the week, I'd risk suspension of my license. They cited public safety, emotional interference, and animal welfare policy. I listened in silence, the notice trembling just slightly in my hand. I think what shook me most wasn't the words. It was the fact that none of this had been written with any belief in what was actually happening between those two creatures. After Ronan left, I walked to the enclosure with the paper still folded in my fist. Maera stood where she always did now, her head low, feathers slightly puffed. Thimble had begun copying her movements with uncanny mimicry, stretching her back, turning her head slowly, blinking in rhythm with the owl above her. I watched them for a long time, longer than I meant to, trying to figure out what part of this was mine to control. That evening, I called Jonah. I asked if there was any way the surgery could be done here, on site. He hesitated, then said, "It's risky, but I'll ask the board." Sia was furious when I told her about the relocation order. She sat on the porch for hours, arms wrapped around her knees, silent. When she finally spoke, it was quiet, but sure. "If you send them away, they'll break." I wanted to tell her I didn't have a choice, but that was the lie I kept telling myself. I did have a choice. I just didn't know if I could live with either one. The house was quieter than usual the night before I was supposed to give my final decision. The kind of quiet that feels full, like the walls are listening. I sat at the kitchen table with Jonah, blueprints of a makeshift surgical space spread between us. "We could do it here," he said, but barely. The risks were high. Anesthesia in a non-sterile environment, no backup staff, and worst of all, if something went wrong, we'd have no margin for error. If she wakes confused or panicked, he added, she might lash out. And the kitten, I didn't let him finish. I knew what he meant. If Maera forgot Thimble, or worse, turned on her, the story would end in blood. No fairy tale, just instinct and tragedy. Sia stood in the doorway, arms folded, her eyes glassy and defiant. Then I'll stay with her, she said, during the surgery. I'll hold Thimble. I'll talk to Maera. She knows me now. Jonah started to protest, but I raised a hand. I could see it in her. She wasn't just asking, she was already decided. Later, after Jonah left, I stepped out into the enclosure one last time before the morning light would turn our choices into actions. Maera was on her perch, feathers fluffed high, breathing slow. Thimble was asleep below, curled against her shadow. When I stepped close, Maera looked at me, not with fear, not with warning, but with something softer. Permission, maybe even trust. And so I whispered, tomorrow we try, but only if you're ready. She didn't move. But in the faint hush of the wind, I could swear I heard her exhale, long and low, as if she already knew what we'd chosen. Dawn arrived in a hush of silver mist, the forest still wet with sleep, every branch and leaf holding its breath. Inside the makeshift surgical tent we'd rigged in the barn, the air was sterile with tension. Jonah moved with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, preparing the anesthesia drip. Sia sat on a stool near the far wall, Thimble curled against her chest, her small body vibrating with a constant nervous purr. We'd agreed she wouldn't be near the table, but she refused to leave the room. She needs to hear us, she said, her voice raw with something I didn't dare name. Maera was calm. Too calm, maybe. She let me lift her without a struggle, her weight heavy in my arms in a way it hadn't been weeks ago. I laid her down, murmured softly as Jonah adjusted the mask over her beak, and her eyes blinked, once, slowly, as if memorizing the room. And then the surgery began. For 47 minutes, the world narrowed to the rustle of gloves, the hiss of breath through masks, the muted beeping of a heart monitor not built for birds. I watched Maera's chest rise and fall, waiting for any sign, any twitch, any moment where everything might go wrong. Outside, a wind had picked up, rattling the old wooden frame of the barn. Sia whispered to Thimble, over and over again, she's coming back, she's coming back, she's coming back. But there was a moment, 34 minutes in, when Maera stopped breathing. Just stopped. Jonah's voice cut the silence. Callum, we moved fast, injected, stimulated, cleared her airway. Seconds felt like hours, everything blurred, and then, just as suddenly, her chest rose again. Shallow, but there. Not safety. Not yet. But not the end either. Callum kneels in the barn's half-light, his breath hitching as he withdraws trembling hands from Maera's still form. Maera lies draped in a rumpled blanket on the table where moments ago her heart faltered. Outside, dawn breaks over the Scottish Highlands. Gentle rays slip through the open door, striping Maera's speckled feathers with gold. In the hush, even the wind holds its breath. Thimble creeps forward, eyes huge and glistening, and presses himself against Maera's side with a hopeful mewl. Sia sits back on her heels, a bloodied swab in her hand, watching through tears. Her steady fingers quiver against her lips as she silently urges the owl to breathe. Callum's throat aches. He leans forward, resting a trembling hand on Thimble's back as the kitten burrows into Maera's downy chest. For a heartbeat, all is still, then a twitch. Maera's talons curl slightly, the monitor beeps as a fragile rhythm returns. Callum chokes out an incredulous laugh that dissolves into a sob. Maera's eyelids flutter, revealing a glimmer of amber. A weak, questioning hoot escapes her, barely a whisper on the wind. Thimble responds with a purr, nuzzling under her outstretched wing. Maera musters her strength to shift her great wing, cradling the trembling kitten against her. Sia exhales and breaks into a shaky smile, one hand over her heart. Callum bows his head, tears spilling as relief and wonder wash over him. In that quiet moment, dust motes dance in the first light as an unlikely family is knit together. Maera is alive, though fragile, and Thimble gazes up at her as if a dream has come true. The outcome is uncertain, but for now hope is a warm presence. In the gentle rise and fall of Maera's chest beneath him, Thimble finds the comfort of a mother's love. In the days that followed, the house changed. It wasn't louder, not exactly, but the air felt different, softer, like something invisible had settled into the walls. Maera remained weak, often resting with her head tucked beneath her wing, but she was eating again, slowly. Thimble never left her side. The kitten had taken to curling into the folds of Maera's feathers, her small body rising and falling with the owl's shallow breath like the tide against a shore. I'd never seen a bond like it, not in years of wildlife work, not in all the quiet miracles nature had shown me. Sia came every afternoon after school, still drawing, but quieter now. Her sketches had changed. They were no longer fairy tales. They were real, portraits of fatigue, of hope, of the strange, radiant tenderness that lived in Maera's tired eyes and Thimble's unrelenting devotion. Jonah visited less, but when he did, he'd linger longer by the enclosure, saying nothing, just watching. We didn't know how long Maera had. Maybe months, maybe more, maybe less. But whatever time she had, it would be spent like this. Wings gently spread, kitten tucked close, and no more fences between them. Sometimes I wonder if we witnessed something unnatural, or if we simply caught a glimpse of nature at its most extraordinary. Maybe Maera wasn't meant to be a mother. Maybe she simply chose to be one. And Thimble, in all her fragile persistence, had dared to ask for it. If this story moved you, even in the smallest way, let it sit with you for a while. Let it remind you that sometimes love shows up in ways we don't expect. In the hush of feathers, in a mule at the edge of a cage, in a choice made not by logic, but by something far deeper. We may never fully understand what happened between Thimble and Maera, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's enough to know it happened. If you've ever believed that connection can cross boundaries, that healing comes in strange forms, that trust can live between predator and prey, then you're part of this story too. We'll keep sharing these moments, these impossible rescues and quiet miracles. If you'd like to follow more of them, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Callum's place? And if there's someone in your life who could use a reminder of hope, share this story with them. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to ask and the grace to answer.